So just to wrap this up really quickly, we mentioned women in ministry in the church, reproductive issues, sexual issues. Um, Gender of God is a thing that we don't talk about a lot, particularly in conservative church, but it's one of those issues that has become a part of feminist theology. Does God have gender? I say no, God doesn't have gender. I know that in the Scripture, God's represented as male. I think that's probably because the dominant audience for the Scripture was always a male-dominated audience, particularly in ancient Jewish culture. That was a very patriarchal society. They would not have understood or bought into an idea that had God as being feminine or being probably even genderless. But I'm pretty convinced myself that God doesn't have gender because gender comes with specific genitalia and hormones and chromosomes, and I don't believe God has any of that. So I don't think God has gender. I don't know that we should speak of God as masculine. I don't think it's a horrible, horrible thing if we do, but I don't know if it's the most appropriate thing. Maybe we should learn to speak of God as without gender. And then if we extrapolate that a little bit, then we have, well, what about the Scripture? What about the idea of promoting or doing a translation of the Scripture that's gender free or gender neutral? Is that valid? Is it valuable? Should we teach that? Should we try to move our churches that way? I think there are a lot of questions there. And then, as we mentioned, what should marriage be like? And this is where we kind of can take some of this and really kind of think about how does this fit into the family. And we'll talk about it as we talk about marriage in the next week or two. We'll talk about marriage specifically, and we'll get back to applying some of these ideas instead of talking about them just kind of in theoretical terms. But what about an egalitarian marriage versus a complementarian marriage versus a really fundamentalist marriage versus whatever else we could come up with? There's, as we've said, the question of submission, the question of authority, the question of roles that we play. What should those be? Should there be any roles? Should anyone submit to anybody? When we make decisions in a family, should somebody be in charge? In my undergrad class, I always ask, this question about roles and decision making, and people at Hardin-Simmons, as you might expect, almost always answer with the idea that, well, it should be kind of egalitarian, but if it comes down to making a final decision, somebody has to be in charge. Well, maybe not. I think that's a good question for couples to think about. And I think it's a good question if we think about how marriage is supposed to work. Does somebody need to be in charge? Or can two people actually be equal and function in an egalitarian way and not have one person be in charge over the other? I kind of tend to think that that's very possible to do. But not everybody agrees with that. So we'll talk about a lot of that more when we talk about just marriage in general. So our last big question here, can you develop a Christian feminism? I think you can. Now, but I want you to think about it yourself. I want you to think, what do I do with the idea of feminism? Does it fit with me? Do I like it? Do I dislike it? Do I disagree with it? Do I think it's biblical? Do I think it's unbiblical? Does it work in my own life? Does it work in my institutional setting? And what does it mean to me as a minister? What will it mean to me as a therapist working with couples in particular? What will it mean to me if I'm a person who's in charge of raising young people, either as a parent or as a church worker or whatever role? If I'm influencing kids, what would it mean to me to understand feminist thinking? And should I? How do I deal with that? How do I apply it? So there's a look at gender. We'll come back and we'll apply this in lots of different ways as we go through the semester. So if you have any questions or comments about this, throw them up on a discussion board and we'll talk about it. And I'll be back in a few days with our next set of videos.